Great. So we should get the results of the poll shortly. So can we show the results? Okay. Oh, great. So 72% of us have had our business operations and mode of doing business adversely affected, 28% slightly. 67% of us have had to review our corporate strategy, and 39% of us actually had the possibility of a global pandemic as a threat in their corporate strategy. So great results. We would reflect on them later on during the fireside chat. So I'd like to invite Opeyemi. What I didn't say about Opeyemi is that Opeyemi and I are actually classmates from University of Ife, Faculty of Law. So it's just great to be having this conversation together. So Opeyemi, if you could take us through your presentation just before we have the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Cecilia. It's a big pleasure and privilege having this conversation. Thanks, BC and the DCSL team. I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, fantastic. So I'll try to, what I'm going to do for the benefit of all of those on the call is spend a few minutes contextualizing the conversation. What is this thing called strategy? Just a few minutes, and then I'm going to be talking through the typical issues that arise in strategy and highlighting how and raising questions about how some of these things may or may not have been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and then raising questions that strategists would probably be concerned about before we have the chat with Cecilia. Thank you so much, Cecilia. It's an honor to be having this conversation with you. So okay, I had this there, but I won't bother with that. So I like to demystify strategy. You know, I like to make it uncomplex. So first of all, I see that a lot of people are scared by the word strategy, and a lot of people, the word gets thrown around. And I always say there's no big deal about strategy. We all do it. Every individual starts from a point in their youth, maybe in primary school, maybe in secondary school, somehow form a sense of what they would like to be in life, navigate all the obstacles, and there are all of them, so many obstacles. They have to execute those things they dream of doing, and execution, even at the level of the individual, is a challenge because there are trade-offs, there are choices to be made, and in the end, they end up somewhere. If it works, they succeed. If they fail, well, maybe they made the wrong choice of career, maybe they couldn't execute, maybe they had some weaknesses that ended up derailing their potential. And that's what strategy is. And nations, of course, do strategy. Of course, we all know in Nigeria about something we call the NEEDS, which was National Economic Empowerment and Development Strategy. Or indeed, if you read the book From Third World to First, Singapore, I regard this as the strategy text in the context of nations. There was a leader who articulated a vision in the midst of severe obstacles, who executed, who had a strategy and turned this country into a first world nation within a period of 30 years. That was for me, it's one of the best strategy texts I've ever had to read in the context of nations. And you can contrast why one nation, Singapore, could make that transition versus why other nations may not have. And you would find lessons that strategists will find very valuable. Of course, the original sphere of strategy was the military. And it's not coincidence that it was in the military that people first had to be clear about the game they were going to play. Because the consequences in the context of the military for not having a strategy was death, destruction, your nation taken into servitude, the soldiers taken into slavery, destruction or plunder of their countries. So the consequences for the absence of strategy in the context of the military was severe. And so quite naturally, military soldiers from the earliest of times began to think clearly about how they were going to play the game. I joke, half joke, because there's also some truth indeed, that the Bible, for instance, which some of us know a bit, and maybe even all other spiritual books, are books of strategy. There's always a war going on, a great spiritual endeavor, a perpetual warfare between the kingdom and another kingdom, and some rules as to who will prevail, but a lot of contention along the way, environmental issues along the way. And I found as a teacher of strategy for many years that the context that makes my students best understand strategy is sports, because that's something they do all the time. So especially I make fun of Arsenal fans, that their team wins the games, but ultimately it doesn't often win the championship. They beat my team for the FA this time, so the egg is on my face. But sports teaches you a lot about strategy, about winning each game, about the formation of the team, about the role of leadership, the coach, the captain, the striker, the goalkeeper, about how teams work, maybe better than individuals, and all of that. And you find, even if you look into how people play the games of love and friendship, that you have to deploy some strategy. You have to identify the target market. You have to define your approach. You have to understand your end goal. And if you succeed, you win a heart and a mind. But today our conversation is about strategy in the context of business, business strategy, corporate strategy. And without defining what corporate strategy is, in loose terms, you're always talking about success in business. You're trying about creating and sustaining a successful business, or competitive advantage, or a market share, or dominance in the market space, or superiority in products and services. You want to lead innovation, you want to create value, you want to be very profitable. Those are the aspirations behind the practice of strategy. And it is always useful, I find, because most people do think of strategy in a one-dimensional manner. They think of it as a plan. What's our plan? Which truly strategy is. It's largely about planning. I mentioned the military, in which, it was all about planning. But there's something that illustrates why strategy is not all about planning. And that's the question of uncertainty, which is at the core of our conversation today. So strategy, you may say, let me say loosely, maybe 60% planning, maybe 70% planning. But there's something else in strategy, and that's what I also want to highlight. I'm taking this from one of the brilliant strategy authors called Henry Mintzberg, who wrote about 5 P's for strategy, 5 ways in which you could understand strategy. And it's all an elephant, they're all correct, but the totality of it is what strategy is. So strategy is also a ploy, or a series of ploys. And that's the realm of tactics, specific responses to circumstances. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along to the subject of COVID-19. Curiously, one of my favorite ways of looking at strategy is as a pattern in a stream of actions. If you have the ability to recognize patterns, you probably will be a good strategist. If you see patterns before everybody sees them, whether it's in the context of the economy, whether it's in the context of the industry, when you see patterns emerging, you recognize them and you project them. And when a company is executing a strategy, a pattern emerges, whether they've written down that strategy or not. So a strategy may be viewed as a pattern in a stream of actions, consistency in behavior, whether they have articulated it or not, whether they have planned it or not. And in this realm, we talk about strategy sometimes, oftentimes, being urgent rather than necessarily deliberate. And then you can understand strategy, of course, as positioning, strategic positioning. Have we positioned this company? What is BMW? How is it different from Toyota or Rolls-Royce or Tata? So strategy is often about strategic positioning. And finally, there's the intangible aspect of strategy, the perspective of the firm, or indeed of its leadership, its worldview, its culture, the firm personality. If you take the totality of these 5 contexts, and that's what they are, context in which strategy is visible, you have a sense for what strategy is. And I mentioned the difference between strategy and tactics. You know, tactics is a part of strategy, but it's part of strategy. Certainly not all of strategy. It's short-term, it's specific, it's isolated, maybe reactive. Strategy is always proactive. It's always planning forward. It's always thinking forward. It's always long-term. It's always comprehensive. Strategy always involves a synthesis. You take all of the considerations together and you synthesize. And taking from the football analogy, strategy is always focused on winning the championship, or from the military, winning the war. But tactics may be about winning a specific game or a specific battle. Again, I will come back to this because I think it's important. So strategy, I don't like definitions necessarily, but strategy is about choosing the future for your company and how to reach that future. It may be a plan, it may be a pattern, it may be both, it may be all of those P's, but it coordinates, it unifies and integrates your decisions. So at the end of the day, the decisions and actions are the most important part because that's what results in the variable performance that strategy seeks. Strategy seeks variable performance. You want performance to change for the better, hopefully. And you could look at this as an overarching plan for marshalling an organization to succeed in an uncertain environment. So there is uncertainty, and that's why strategy is difficult. It's about the future. It's not about the past. It's not about the present. You're doing a plan for the future. And because the future is uncertain, the job of the strategist becomes intricate. And perhaps one of the tests of strategy is whether there's a fit, the internal, the external, consistency, whether they fit with the value proposition, whether the elements of the strategy mutually reinforce themselves, and whether they lead to optimization of effort. So that's what we're talking about, just for context. And I spoke about choice of the future. And from now on, I'll begin to introduce the pandemic and the subject of today into the conversation. So the beginning of strategy is always a choice of your future. It can be the long-term future, the essence of the business, the purpose of the business. It can be a mission statement or a vision statement, or it can be more practical and more immediate, a strategic intent for a period of time. So for instance, if we were going to do a strategic intent today for a new business, we would be thinking of what we want to achieve within, say, 3 years or 5 years, or maybe 1 year even. But strategic intent is vision made measurable, made quantifiable, made achievable in tangible terms. And then, of course, you have more shorter terms, objectives, goals, targets, trade-offs. What choices do you have to forego? And these are all important concepts in strategy, and I mentioned the intangible element, the values of the firm, the philosophy of the firm, the culture of the firm. If I ask the question, if you were doing all of this, answering all of these questions pre-COVID or post-COVID, forming strategic intent, defining vision or purpose, setting objectives and goals and targets, choosing trade-offs. Obviously, the COVID-19 has affected some of the decisions that will be made in the process. For instance, the trade-off is how much control you want over the physical presence of your employees. Some companies all across the world have found that the inevitability of making a trade-off over physical presence of the employee in favor of their virtual activity. And that involves redefining the objectives and goals and targets, because if you can't control physical presence, you better be able to control the outcomes of their work. So COVID-19 involves in doing many of these things, focusing more on outcomes, because at least from the HR point of view, from the management point of view, putting the focus not on the presence of the guy, not on the physical meeting, but perhaps on the outcomes, so that you can then measure whether the guy is working or not. Let me walk through some of the most common frameworks that we encounter in strategy. One of the most familiar, probably the most familiar, everybody can do that, is
I think we've just lost Okayemi. We'll try to reconnect him very quickly. Please give us a few minutes. We're getting him back online quickly. Our apologies. Thank you for your understanding.
Hello.
Hi. Great, you're back.
I'm so sorry. I think I lost my primary internet source, so I had to change to an alternative I had prepared. I'm so
So,
sorry.
no, but great that you have the redundancy that you could apply very quickly. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll just catch up on lost time. So I was talking about SWOT analysis just before the break.
Yes, you were just going to start on the SWOT analysis.
Yeah. So I asked a question, and I think the poll asked that one of those questions. When we were doing SWOT analysis, how much did we focus on technology competence as a barometer for corporate strength or weakness? Particularly, for instance, you were not primarily a technology company. Many firms, for instance, financial services companies, paid lip service or indeed some level of execution around technology, digital competencies, all of that. But how often did we really do that? And did we regard it as a critical test of our survival as organizations? COVID-19, of course, has changed that. I asked the question and I was pleasantly surprised that 39% of respondents said the strategy analysis identified the global pandemic as a threat. I suspect that may be a little bit inflated, but probably maybe 5% of firms pre-COVID. Yes, today everybody understands those type of risks. Or indeed, global supply chains. We saw a severe disruption of global supply chains in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially supply chains dependent on China and any of those places that were most severely affected by the COVID-19. But one of the more important contemporary questions is, are there ways the pandemic could be an opportunity? Are we revising our posture towards the pandemic to view it as an opportunity? Indeed, there have been a saving grace for institutions that did not invest sufficiently in digital capabilities. Could it be a saving grace for institutions whose supply chains were monolithic and that were dependent on one singular country source of raw materials in an era in which that country's operations were severely devastated? So there are lessons that the pandemic could be offering if firms are indeed examining their strategy accordingly. And then, of course, we talk about the business environment in strategy a lot. We talk about SPELG in the context of RTC. We have a model we call SPELG, which is around looking at the social, political, economic, legal, regulatory, and technology environments, and then all in the context of the global. And I think that, and the focus is always on sources of risk and uncertainty. And I think the pandemic has highlighted all the relevance of models of business environment analysis. So for instance, social issues. The pandemic has essentially, in many respects, at least at the height of it, crippled social society and essentially turned society into a virtual alternative in which you only communicated with most of your contacts through telephones or other internet sources or communication sources. And then, of course, political. The whole of the pandemic has become embedded in the politics, for instance, of the United States of America. I think many of the complications around the management of the pandemic have arisen because somehow in the context of an inevitable or imminent election, the US politics has become embedded in the management or the response to the pandemic. So for instance, if Trump embeds himself in a consideration around hydroxychloroquine, people are inclined not to accept it or to accept it depending on what part of the political divide they are. And indeed, even in Nigeria, we saw an election in Edo State in which whether there could be a rally or not was an issue, as political matters became embedded in the issues around the COVID-19. The big...
Amy, may I just, can you please put your slide on, can you please put the presentation on slide mode?
Okay, please. I didn't do that when I came back on.
Yes.
So,
Great.
so I was talking about the big issue being the economy. Some of us who focus more on economy than medicine, even at the beginning of the COVID-19, we were concerned that where was the analysis in terms of global policy responses? Was it sufficiently analyzing the trade-offs? And this is not a cold-hearted question, but the question is, economics is always about choices. How many people are going to get sick? How many people are going to die? What's the costs in economic terms? Weighed against the cost of shutting down the global economy. These were very difficult questions, but understandably, in the context of something that was killing people, that didn't have a cure, that we didn't know how long it would last, we didn't know who would live, who would not live, we had to respond first to the health. And now we have to respond to the economy. And we're faced with global recession, Nigerian recession, devastation of economies, all of these considerations. So how now do we go from there to rebuilding economics? Those are all the questions. And when will the economy recover? How will it affect our businesses? What is Nigeria, for instance? How is our economic sustainability plan going to work? All of those questions have been highlighted in the context of, and I could go on and on and on and on. But the key point is to highlight how the analysis of the business environment has been dramatically altered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is the model I was talking about, the spell G. So will there be a cure? I'm talking about the key uncertainties, some of them that have arisen out of COVID-19. Will there be a cure? When? Is hydroxychloroquine a cure? Does the medical community agree? Will there be a vaccine? When? At what cost? How long will the pandemic last? Will Trump be elected in November? Because it now matters. Who will be alive? Who might die? Mortality itself is questioned. So the CEO, whose primary concern most times is about the success of the business, is greatly concerned these days about whether he will be alive. And you find that people tend to want to stay alive if that's the cost of corporate success. Can schools be reopened? Are air flights safe? Can businesses safely reopen? What will happen to oil prices? What will be average oil prices for the rest of 2020? And that's an important question from Nigeria's point of view. Do we have a recession, a depression, a brief recession, a deep and prolonged recession? I think the IMF's estimate is something I accept, around a 5% recession, minus 5% growth in 2020 for Nigeria. That's deep, that's severe. Will the economic sustainability plan, which is an attempt to mitigate some of that and reduce the rate of the recession maybe to 1% or less, will it succeed? Can it be implemented? Does it address the key questions? Is there enough political will and capacity for implementation behind many of the ideas proposed in that plan? And then there's a very important question, and I hear this question all the time. In the context of this, what is the ideal planning cycle? Should we abandon all planning and just plan as we go? Should we do a one-year plan that will merely address at least the short term so that we'll reevaluate after a year if the pandemic is gone? Or 18 months, or is it 2 years? Or should we ignore that and continue with our normal cycles, maybe 3 years for many firms? Or indeed, should we defer planning until the pandemic is over and just focus on tactical responses? Remember, I spoke about tactics and strategy. Do we have a narrow plan for surviving the pandemic? Maybe if, for instance, you were an airline or a hotel, which are some of the most severely affected firms in the context of this. Should we just focus on short-term survival? Or what if we were in the middle of our plan? All of these questions have become critical questions in the context of COVID-19. And when we come to question and answers, perhaps I may attempt answers to some of them. One of the most familiar strategy frameworks is the Porter 5 forces analysis, which focus on entry into an industry, suppliers, buyers, competition, the threat of substitute products and services. And for those of us who are familiar with strategy, we know that apart from Porter, 2 other authors, Badenberger and Nailboff, introduced a 6th force that the Porter framework did not cover, and that was complementors. So we now have in the field of strategy, essentially 6 forces, Porter plus, I call them, of entry, of suppliers, of substitutes, of buyers, of complementors, and of course, in the context of industry competition. So the question is, what has happened to industries in the context of COVID-19? Something that is clear is that technology and communication is the big winner. E-commerce, digital business, all of those things around technology. Let me draw an analogy with consolidation of the Nigerian banking industry. In 2001, I did an analysis of the banking industry, which I presented at Lagos Business School at their financial sector conference that year. And one of the things I saw was that the industry was consolidating. But guess what? Maybe if the industry was left on its own to consolidate, it would have taken a decade or more, or 2 decades. But guess what? 3 years later, Professor Soludo came and forced a process of consolidation, which may have taken 1 or 2 decades or more, into an 18-month period, and forced the industry to consolidate. I see a parallel with what COVID-19 has done with forcing digitalization, forcing virtualization, forcing firms to embrace digital competencies rather than do it at their own pace as we would have done. Of course, the other big losers, hotels, airlines, travel, as I've mentioned. And then oil and gas, from Nigeria's point of view, of course, the demand for oil and gas is always contingent on global activity. And when there's a collapse of global activity, as entailed in the COVID-19, there was a collapse of oil prices. So, but the strategic questions for businesses in Nigeria and in this sector is, what's the outlook for this industry? This is as a result of COVID-19. We've had previous ones as collapses in oil prices as a result of global financial crisis, or as a result of an oil glut, or as a result of even sometimes geopolitical factors, wars, or so on. So what next? Is the oil and gas sector doomed to regular cycles of price collapses? When is the next one? If you look at my slide, we had a collapse in 2008 to 9, we had one in 2014 to 15, and now we have this in 2020. And the policy implications for a country dependent on oil and gas for its budgets and its effects, which then plague the corporate sector as the consequences of FX shortages and revenue shortages emerge, then becomes an issue for strategy in the context of firms. Agriculture is also a likely winner. Healthcare is a likely winner. The question for real estate is, of course, is being plagued by declines even from recession of 2014-15, and doesn't seem to have recovered. It was just the beginning, a slow process of recovery, and then COVID-19 may have just reversed that. So is the real estate sector likely doomed for another postponement of its recovery? Probably yes. And then, of course, we've seen that professional services, whatever services, you have to be able to do them on a virtual basis in the context of COVID-19. The question is, are markets going to revert to the face-to-face delivery mechanisms after COVID? Probably not to the extent that they were. So this may be temporary, and some who are short-sighted about strategy may take a view that, no, this is just around the COVID, and we can go back to normal afterwards. But maybe more proactive firms may regard this as a permanent change in the equilibrium, and therefore may begin to deal with a new normal on that basis. One of the things that is clear, one of the biggest consequences of COVID-19 on Nigeria, deriving from oil and deriving also from our policy environment, which is focused on government spending and borrowings is that we have not attracted foreign direct investment, and therefore FX inflows outside of all have slowed. So implicitly, in the short term, at least until we change our policy dynamic, business models dependent on FX purchases appear to be in mortal danger, except for those with marginal volumes of FX input, or on the other hand, with very large FX markets that can accommodate the continued devaluation of the naira. There's a policy implication I see out of this. Policy will have to change in favor of private capital and investment versus oil revenue and borrowings. And I think the economic sustainability plan makes the right calls in that direction. So the key issue now is, are we able to implement that? Of course, it's imperative to restructure public financial management and revenue management. In the context of all businesses, and this is everybody, consumer purchasing power is being eroded. In the context, remember, of a recession, which is we're already in probably, higher poverty, higher levels of unemployment, and weaker economic outlook. So whether you're a manufacturing entity or you're a retail, the erosion of consumer purchasing power will affect everybody. Now, so I move on to briefly talk about generic competitive strategies. We have basic concepts of strategy. You compete in 3 generic matters. It's more complicated than that, but in this conversation, let's take it as 3 generic forms of competition. You try to differentiate yourself, you try to lead on cost, or you focus on a narrow segment of the market. So the question is, how does a virtual business environment affect customer experience and the customer definition of value? So the parameters around which the customer measures firms is changing. For instance, a bank, or maybe even his telecoms company. Suddenly, it's not about the beauty of the banking hall, but the beauty of the digital environment. How might the virtual business environment in a post-COVID era redefine customers' perceptions of differentiation or firms' cost structures? So for instance, another way with this could be a great opportunity for proactive firms is that in the context of this environment, cost structures for businesses may be radically altered for those who are able to embrace a digital business model. And therefore, you could suddenly find a lot of disruption in businesses in which a contender suddenly becomes a strong a leader in an industry because he's able to take advantage of the opportunity offered by the virtual business environment. And having lost the game in the physical banking hall, for instance, if he's able to dominate the virtual banking hall, perhaps we could find new leaders across industries, in consulting, in business, in manufacturing, and all of that. How will this new environment affect business processes and therefore service delivery? How will it affect organizational structures? How will it affect innovation processes or management information or indeed HR systems? Any firm that is able to build new advantages out of all of this may indeed find that it gains competitive advantage in the post-COVID era. And I spoke already about disruption. I put this as a question: will the post-COVID era be expected to accelerate the pace of disruption in conventional or mature industries? And I think the answer is yes. It will accelerate the disruption for those who are able to respond to the reshaping of the business environment. So this offers opportunities and offers threats for those who may be less able to adapt as quickly as possible to the environment. Firms may be able to re-examine their value chain and find sources for optimizing resources, for improving customer experience, for improving business processes, for improving farm infrastructure, around management, around finance, around planning, and all of that. And therefore, may be in a position to gain new sources of competitive advantage. We talk about blue ocean strategy. I won't dwell too much on that. But the point is that the COVID-19 era offers an opportunity for people to find new and uncharted competitive spaces, new advantages, new supply chains, new trajectories for innovation, all of which suddenly may find that farm in a blue ocean in which it is relatively uncontested and therefore able to extract greater value, makes competition irrelevant, makes the farm able to create and capture new sources of demand, and makes it able to lead both with differentiation and with cost, and therefore have almost unlimited capacity to extract value. And for the purposes of my presentation, I'll take the conversation with Cecilia and with the questions and answers. But for the purposes of my presentation, the last poser I would leave for all of us is how will firms manage execution in the post-COVID era, with the assumption that a lot more of the activities will be does it mean virtual meetings at 8 a.m. and 9 a.m. and 11 p.m.? Does it mean more of outsourcing? Does it mean focus on outcomes rather than work? What are all the implications for execution? Was already difficult when you had all the people under your physical control and your physical monitoring, and you could do meetings, and you could give deadlines and do all of those things man to man or face to face or in meetings. Does it become complicated, or indeed does it become actually easier to do in a virtual environment? That would be my parting poser in the context of the presentation. I'll be happy to clarify any of these issues in my conversation with Cecilia and in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Wow, fantastic. Quite an insightful presentation. And I must say, this is a whole course on strategy you've given to us for free. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So just to remind our participants, there's a Q&A box. I know some of us have already sent our questions. Others, please take the opportunity, send your questions into the Q&A box. We're going to actually devote time to responding to your questions. But I really would like us to do a deeper dive into your presentation. And, you know, as you were speaking, I kept on remembering, you know, the statement of Donald Rumsfeld, the former US Secretary of State, on unknown unknowns. Well, it does appear that we are in a period of uncertainty with many unknown unknowns, as well as huge known unknowns. So many unknown unknowns and huge known unknowns. So how do you formulate strategy in the midst of mostly uncertainty?
Excellent question, Cecilia. And I'll say this. You know, one of the things I was passionate about as I got into the field of strategy was uncertainty. And I found a series then done by the Harvard Business School. And I think it was titled Strategy and Uncertainty. And I found one reading that has stuck with me till today. And the learning I want our participants to take from that reading, which you may Google, Strategy and Uncertainty, Harvard Business School. There was one beautiful article that focused on levels of uncertainty. So the first thing, and what Donald Rumsfeld was talking about, was what in strategy we called level 4 uncertainty, the highest level of unknown unknowns. It was his own colloquial way of talking about level 4 uncertainty. That's true uncertainty. Because much of what we think is uncertain or which we dismiss as uncertain is subject to analysis. And so first of all, there's level one as uncertainty. If you do some real analysis, if you investigate the business environment, if you examine the trends, if you look at all of those things going on in the business environment, you would have significant clarity around what's going on. If you move to level 2 and 3 uncertainty, most of the things we experience in business on a day-to-day basis are what we call level 2 and 3 uncertainties. That is the realm of scenario planning. And I will urge our participants to embrace scenario planning. I don't think we do enough of that in Nigeria. I think in the West, firms are more accustomed to do a lot of scenario planning around the industry environment, around the global environment, around the business environment, the industry, products and services, geopolitical risk, all of the considerations. And that's why, for instance, the US is what it is. It's always, it's intelligence forces, it's businesses, it's Microsoft, it's businesses, it's large firms, and even all of its consulting resources in the McKinseys and the Bains of this world are centered around what's next, what's the outlook, what are the scenarios. I love scenario planning. And I find that it answers many of the questions that we worry about around strategy. Now there is true level 4 uncertainty, when even the variables are not known, when even it's not predictable how things will play out. I suspect that even with the level of uncertainty that the COVID-19 pandemic has presented, maybe initially it started out looking like a level 4 uncertainty. We didn't know whether this was going to kill all of us. We didn't know whether it was going to have a 60% death rate, for instance. If it had a 60% death rate, Cecilia and I would not be probably comfortable enough to have this conversation. But eventually, eventually we found that this is not true uncertainty. Yeah, there are severe levels of uncertainty, but it's subject to analysis, subject to scenario planning. We can't throw our hands up in the air. We have some sense about how long this might take. We can project when there may be a vaccine or cures. We're beginning to even believe that there are probable cures, even though controversial. And then we can see many of the economic consequences. We can see the disruptions that are likely to be caused. So I would say that firms should invest more in thinking and planning around scenarios across all of the uncertainties, and they may be able to better manage some of these risks.
Fantastic. Now, what is your advice to boards and CEOs that are midstream the execution of their corporate strategy? Where do they go from here?
Again, another brilliant question, Cecilia. Now, this is a more contextual question, and I would say the answer is, as with many things in strategy, it depends. Now, it depends on what. So we have to ask a question for each situation. What has this done, COVID-19, to the fundamental assumptions behind my strategy? Now, so the question is this a temporary disruption, or is there a new equilibrium? In many respects, and the skill for the CEO and the analysis that is required, what is it that has changed forever? And what is it that is just a temporary strategy and tactics? And I said that we would talk about that a lot. If all the assumptions of your strategy are valid in spite of COVID-19, if the key or the critical assumptions are valid in spite of COVID-19, regard this as a temporary crisis, have a crisis response plan, a tactical plan for responding to what COVID-19 has caused, but continue with the execution of your strategy. On the other hand, are there elements of your strategy that has been undercut forever? For instance, accelerated digitization. For instance, supply chains. So the key analysis is that concerning the fundamental assumptions in my strategy, if things have changed fundamentally, I suspect you may have to embark on the new strategy. And that's why I spoke about the issue around planning cycles. And even if you wanted to do a new strategy exercise, you will now be faced with the question of, how long do I do this for? Or do I take a short-term view of it? Do I take a longer-term view of it? And I would say that I've had different experiences, so it depends on the circumstances. I sat with some group of entrepreneurs who are starting a new business, brilliant people with accomplished record of strategy execution in established context, but they were now in a startup posture. And they chose to ignore COVID-19, in fact, regard it as an opportunity, and just continue the execution and implementation of the strategy. Incidentally, this was a health sector related business. So the answer for different people may be slightly different. I suspect, for instance, if a firm, let's say a financial services firm, if your strategy was defective from the beginning and you didn't sufficiently focus on digitization, maybe it's time to throw that book out of the window and start a new strategy process. So it depends on the circumstances and whether there's a new equilibrium or whether indeed the fundamental assumptions of your strategy are still valid.
Fantastic. You know, I'm a lover of corporate governance. I live in the world of corporate governance, or I function in the world of corporate governance. So I believe there's a sweet spot where corporate governance and strategy converge, particularly with growing stakeholder consciousness and ESG. Many companies such as Tesla, Google, Uber, Amazon have come out with vision and mission statements. So how do these complement strategy, and which should come first?
Excellent question. You know, I have also been, I used to be chairman of an NGO, and I suspect your chairman at First Bank succeeded me, not suspect, your chairman at First Bank succeeded me as chairman of the Convention on Business Integrity. I've always been involved deeply in those questions around strategy, performance, versus the challenges of sustainability and integrity, especially in the context of a difficult environment like ours, where integrity cannot be taken for granted, and where it often appears as if there are advantages to be derived from the absence of integrity. And this has always been a very difficult question. Of course, for a big period, I've also taught business ethics briefly at the Lagos Business School too. So I've been forced to contend with these questions also in the context of academia. And my conclusion is that you can't separate the questions around governance from strategy. And experience validates that. And I would not like to mention names, but I know a bank that was growing extraordinarily in the 90s and up to the early 2000s. An admirable an admirable looking CEO, a fast growing institution. Everything appeared to be fantastic. And it all came crashing down one day as the central bank under Sanusi Lamido liquidated that institution and sold it to a much smaller institution. And so at the end of the day, you know, the absence of governance, it's like driving a car without brakes. You can speed a lot, you can speed faster, you can be more accelerate, you can accelerate as much as you want. But when the collapse happens, it's calamitous. And that's what we've seen with Enron and all of those global examples. So you know, when I took us through that process of strategy, which was what I actually tried to do, take people in a short conversation through almost the entire process of strategy, of course, in a very summarized version. I started from the choice of the few. And at that point, values matter. What you stand for matters. What you would like to build matters. What your motivation is matters. Whether it's just about making a little bit more money, or whether you would like to leave some enduring values and institutions. And at the end of the day, what is the cost of the lack of governance if you get caught? And people often do get caught. So I think you can separate governance from strategy. I think it's one of the most, in fact, it's one of the earliest questions the farm must answer. What do we stand for? What's our purpose? What are we going to try and do? How are we going to do it? What are our values and what are we trying to build? And once you get governance settled, often it just takes a life of its own. So I share your view that we must focus on governance as we focus on strategy, and indeed regard the two as intertwined.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And you know, I'm sure for everybody, this has really been a period of deep reflection. And I'll tell you one of the things that's been on my mind. You know, we've been talking about winners and losers. And I actually said to myself, so what if we redefine our losers? You know, those who have been caught, as they say, swimming naked. So what if we redefine them as winners in the making? And so what if even losers themselves redefine themselves as winners in the making who need to find their winning strategy? What will be the critical steps to finding that winning strategy? And sorry, I'm going to like crash 3 or 4 questions into each other. So what will be the critical steps to finding that winning strategy? Also, how can we change our perception? And I think this you mentioned during your presentation. How can we change our perception and actually see COVID as a strategic opportunity? And then how do we learn to pivot? So we have the experience of IBM when it comes to pivoting. We have the experience of PayPal that pivoted from a company making security software on handheld devices to the payment platform we're all globally familiar with. So those are the questions on my mind, and I'm sure on the mind of a lot of our participants.
Well, excellent question. I must commend you on all of these deeply insightful strategy questions. You are yourself a strategy professional, given the quality and the depth of these questions. You know, one of the insights I gathered in strategy is how you define yourself is fundamental. So for instance, if you describe yourself as I am a bank, you know, it defines boundaries for your thinking and for your strategy that could be debilitating in the context of disruption or industry change, or indeed somebody else finding a blue ocean. So all of these concepts I've articulated will always come. So how do you define yourself? Do you say I'm a bank, which may have seemed normal decades ago, but which may be limiting now? Or do you say I'm a financial services institution? Or do you say that, taking it to a level of wholeness, do you say that you partner with your clients to solve their problems? Now, that definition, those 3 alternative definitions have severe implications for strategy as well. Or one of the earliest examples I saw at a more basic level, do you call yourself an airline or a transportation service? The strategic implications are different. If you say I'm an airline, that means I only fly planes and I fly them from there to here, and I don't make the planes, but I operate flights, scheduled flights from location to location. If you say I'm a transportation services company, you look at all of the measures by which people can move from place to place. So first of all, one of the broad points I want to make is, what's your self-definition? Is it flexible enough, strategic enough, and does it avoid the limitations of not seeing where competition will come from? Because one of the problems with how you define yourself is you don't see potential competition, and you don't see potential shifts in industry borders. That's one. Two, many firms, you know, one of the problems with becoming a manager, I also learned this very early in strategy. You know, once you become a manager in an industry, you should almost be retired. And that's a joke. But you see, the reason to call you a manager is because you've mastered how the industry is at that point in time. So you've gotten a certificate for knowing how the industry operates at that time. But the real skills for success in business, even for managers in quote, is whether they see where the industry is going, not whether they have mastered how it operates at that point in time. So businesses and leaders have to shift what they evaluate in their managers from people who have mastered the technical details of the current operation, and they do need people to master the technical details of the current operation, but they need people to think more creatively about the requirements of the evolving destination of that industry. Now, at this point in time, so going to the practical question you asked, people have to first, I mean, for those companies that are really classified as losers today, they need a lot of frank conversations. They need to do a self-appraisal, a quick, critical appraisal of the industry. They shouldn't take the posture that this is a temporary crisis, and therefore all we need to do is survive for the end of COVID, and then we'll go back to life. Life may have changed forever. People may have learned new things about how dispensable your service is. People may have learned the environment may have changed. People may have found solutions, alternatives to the solutions you offer. And indeed, in the context of what we're doing in the Porter's framework, the proper Porter's forces, the price performance value of your alternatives may have risen in the context of COVID-19, such that, for instance, Zoom has acquired so much scale in the context of this time that it's going to be far cheaper for it to offer the service forever. And therefore, anybody hoping that after this we will go back, the price performance relationship of Zoom and Microsoft Teams and all of those alternatives has changed forever. And managers and CEOs have found the value of doing meetings virtually and the cost savings, and they're never going to go back to that. So all of these questions, the most important thing you need is a frank conversation on what has changed forever, on where we were, on what the errors we were making were, on the short-term question, the tactical question around how do we survive this pandemic, but then the longer-term strategizing around where we should be going. Are we flexible enough? Are there alternatives? Do our competencies and abilities as an organization give us the ability to diversify into other things or to expand our notion of who we are? Those are the type of questions I would like those losers, in quote, to focus on. And then maybe they may find this as a strategic inflection point that takes them to another level in their corporate evolution.
You know, it's interesting. You've actually answered my next question, which was, you know, quoting from Hamlet, quoting Shakespeare from Hamlet, this above all, to thine own self be true. And the question was the place of honesty and realism and strategy formulation. How fundamental is this? And I think you've actually answered that question. So I think we'll go to some of the
only thing I would add, Cecilia.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add is, in my experience, businesses in Nigeria don't sufficiently tell themselves the truth about their current weaknesses and deficiencies. So the only thing I will add is that we need a lot more truth-telling and independent assessments of where you are in your strategy.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to take one of the questions in our Q&A box. You know, one of the speakers had wanted you to do a deeper, one of our participants had wanted you to please do a deeper dive on your spelt G slide. I don't know if you could just take a quick look at that and just talk to us.
Do I share screen, or I just talk about it?
I think you could just talk about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Spell G was my own copyright. I created Spell G out of my period of research into strategy and uncertainty, into scenario planning, into all of those questions around the business environment in my time as a teacher at the Lagos Business School. And I felt that it was a much more appropriate model. We had the global alternatives, PESTEL, SPEED, all of those alternatives, and I examined all of them. And I concluded that I was teaching a course, so I had some incentive to create Spell G. I was teaching a course, apart from my strategy course at the Lagos Business School. I was teaching the business environment, social, political, and economic environment. And I saw that social, political, and economic was limiting. I saw that we didn't cover sufficiently the other aspects of the business environment. And then as I researched the issues and as I looked for the best framework for confronting the business environment, for analyzing the business environment, I found that you clearly had to add the legal and regulatory environment, which presented a lot of problems for businesses in Nigeria. You clearly had to add the technology environment, which was evolving and is the culmination of COVID-19 and the technology issues we're discussing today are the culmination of what I saw in 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8. You know, because technology was becoming an independent aspect of the business environment, not something you looked at under economic, as some of the other earlier models used to be. And I also felt that anything you were doing, you had to look at it in the context of global development. And that was what I developed into the SPELT G framework. SPELT, S for social, P for political, E for economic, L for legal and regulatory, T for technology, hyphen G, because you all had to do everything in the context of global environment. So that was SPELT G as the levels of analysis you needed to. Of course, you were to focus on what was relevant, what was, where were the sources of risk and uncertainty, and all of it was to culminate, and that's the full dimensions of the model, into scenario planning, so that you could anticipate where the environment was going. So it was not just to do a static analysis of the social, political, economic, and all of those elements, but you are now you're going to use the information you gathered from there, trends and discontinuities, relevant factors, sources of risk and uncertainty, to project into the future and form a view for what the scenarios, the possible scenarios are. And that always, in my own practice, has to precede strategy. Otherwise, you're, as you put it, swimming naked. You're just devising strategy without a realistic or a deeply thought through set of expectations about the future.
Thank you very much. Another one of the questions from the participants is on data and analytics. And, you know, you really, particularly as we're going digital, if you're not analyzing your data, you're probably going to offshoot the runway.
Yeah.
So can you just say a few words about data analytics and how much are you seeing businesses in Nigeria going through that in their strategy formulation process?
Let me say that, I mean, for many of the formal businesses, you tend to find that at the level of macroeconomy, they tend to work with the data. But even with some of, I'm often a bit surprised when I present economic information, which is publicly available, which is something that I got from the National Bureau of Statistics. It's not proprietary information. I got from the IMF, I got from the World Bank, I got from OPEC, I got from publicly available sources. And I'm in a room with managers and leaders. I'm often a bit surprised, pleasantly surprised, because it makes me look like I'm intelligent, but sometimes surprised because it tells me that we don't work sufficiently with data in Nigeria, because these data, like I said, are publicly available. And in many of our industries, we get swamped by the demands of day-to-day work that we don't spend enough intellectual energy retreating from the work and procuring the data, especially those that are publicly available. That's the first level. The second level is, of course, we have severe challenges with more advanced levels of data availability in Nigeria. So we've solved the problem thanks to the National Bureau of Statistics. I'm a big fan of them. In terms of macro.
Am too. I am
yeah,
too.
In terms of, it's good to commend what works. You know, in terms of macroeconomic data, we've come a long way. I know how gruesome it was getting macro data when I started RTC in 2004. I'm a long way from that. So macro data is very available, but we haven't made that transition into real availability of business intelligence, of more industrial sector data, and often also consumer data analytics. So there is an industry waiting to be built around that, clearly, in the Nigerian context. But I think that firms should, as often as possible, as much as possible, invest in supporting firms that have an interest in these areas. Not necessarily supporting them on a charitable basis, but supporting them in terms of challenging their capabilities and asking them, can you produce for this for us? Can you produce this for us? And then help us to grow the availability of data and analytics in the Nigerian business environment.
Thank you. And another question from the participants is, you know, professional services in the physical space, engineering, artisans. What is your advice, particularly when now in a social distancing digital world, but some people feel that, no, I need to be on ground. I need to check that tile. I need to check how the construction is being done. So really, what's your advice for those in that space?
Well, I mean, I'll share personal experiences. I've had one of the biggest assignments that RTC has executed in the context of these times, in the context of virtual, everything from beginning to end, the receiving of instructions, the execution, the research, the delivery, well, virtually, I would say 90% of the delivery. But I admit that RTC's work is more amenable to virtual environment, digital delivery, and all of that. But I also happen to have dealt with an architect in the context of this time, brilliant young architect. And I wish he was on this call so he'll hear the compliments. I've not told him that, but he's delivered everything I've wanted up to the point now of execution, and that's I'm referring to the construction phase. All throughout all of this, with only one physical meeting to get to know him, and then after everything. So, but of course, I do admit that when it comes to delivery, he would have to go on site and do things which can only be done physically. But nobody should think this is going. And then they will go back to lawyers, doctors. I mean, why wouldn't a doctor embrace the option of many of the patients just calling in, doing the diagnosis, and then sending a prescription? And if you must deliver the drugs, having a dispatch man deliver the drugs. Why would you want 20 people sitting down in your waiting room when you can cut the cost of all the things? And the one field that will be a winner from this is telemedicine, very clearly, apart from the whole of the health value chain that will also succeed. My advice to all professionals, service providers, all of them, is that look at every step of your value chain. And yes, you need the face-to-face to build relationships, to build familiarity. But anything that can be routinized into a virtual, digital value chain, please do so. It will save you money. It will build efficiency. It will lower costs. It will improve your the perception of value from your clients.
Thank you very much. There's a question on in this world of shrinking FDIs. What direction do you think remittances from diaspora would go? Will it continue to increase, or because they are being impacted,
interestingly,
it will start to shrink?
So, interestingly, I was looking at the data yesterday in the context of what my colleagues at RTC sent to me around the investment flows from 2019 and in the aftermath of COVID-19. Clearly, remittances, and when you say shrinking FDIs, so for Nigeria has shrunken. I mean, for 2019, Nigeria was the 4th largest recipient of FDI in Africa, behind Egypt, South Africa, and another country, maybe Morocco or so. So clearly we've lost FDI. We used to be first. We used to be around $20 billion of FDI up to 2014. Clearly there are policy issues that the Nigerian government will have to examine in resolving the attractiveness of Nigeria from the point of view of foreign direct investment, and that includes most prominently our exchange rate structure. So that's on the side. Now, in terms of remittances, of course, informal flows from mostly our diaspora back home. Many of these things continue. What happens is that once there are margins and differentials in exchange rates, they become invisible. They become less visible to the central bank and to the financial system, because people don't want to give, if they know that the black market exchange rate is 480, they will never accept a financial institution of the central bank offering the lower rate, or Western Union or whatever. So the remittance then goes invisible. It goes from, how will I send money to somebody who gives me the correct rate, which is fraught with risk, which most people would not like to do if the rates are similar or close enough. So that's one. Then secondly, in the context of COVID-19, many of these diaspora people are of course affected by employment challenges in their primary places of job. So you can expect, because many of them are on unemployment checks, $1,200 from the US government, all of those things that the UK government is giving to support farms. So first of all, you may expect the remittances to reduce due to those natural causes. But a second level is that you may expect them to become less visible until we unite exchange rates, which can then allow them to return to more formal channels for sending the money across. So my answer to the participant is, you might see a real drop in remittances due to the economic challenges faced by Nigerian diaspora people, but then you may also see a second level, which is those remittances become coming in through alternative channels as the gap between the exchange rates, the formal and informal exchange rates widens. But of course, all of this will resolve as the pandemic begins to ease.
Thank you very much. Really interesting questions that we have here. So one of our participants wants to know where you see the place of just healthcare issues and healthcare policies, but within the issues that corporate organizations will focus on.
Yeah, I said I regard the health sector generally as a beneficiary. One of the implications across the world, and particularly in Nigeria, and in Nigeria because suddenly the Nigerian political and social and economic elite found that it was important to have better healthcare domestically. Because the assumption of our elite was always that all of us could go to London, Germany, Egypt, depending on where we like, India, and get medical care. COVID-19 reminded everybody that we have to invest locally. And we saw COVID and the COVID Nigeria and COVID. So the imperative of improving health services has been demonstrated to the Nigerian government, the state governments, and our elite, most important, and also to our development partners. So you can expect a lot of investment there. Secondly, there's a beginnings of corporatization of medical and health services in Nigeria. So people are beginning to focus on health as a business, not simply as a professional activity because I trained as a doctor. So I need to live a sustenance on health. So we're beginning to see the beginnings of hospitals as businesses, corporate businesses. And then one of the big constraints has been the weakness of our health insurance models. But clearly, in the wake of COVID-19, there's going to be continued investment. There's going to be pressure to improve health insurance. There's going to be more of the growth of corporate medical facilities. And therefore, I suspect that we're in a good place going forward. Not now, I don't pretend that we're anywhere near good now, but I think that this is the beginning of a surge in investment in medical care in Nigeria. So the medical businesses will take notice of that. I think that the financial institutions may want to take more look at health insurance. I think that on the other hand, everybody would, I know a few people who are beginning to look at healthcare as an investment opportunity. And that will only happen if it happens with scale, if it happens with corporate governance, which you mentioned, if it happens with the right partnerships globally and locally. And I see the early beginnings of that process.
Fantastic. And I wonder whether organizations are also going to start looking at health issues, the healthcare of their staff, whether there's going to be increased focus by organizations. And of course, that's going to have an impact on the business of healthcare.
Yeah, but well, you know, when large corporates get involved from the employee point of view in healthcare, it typically does two things. When I remember all the case studies I taught around healthcare, typically US companies, but I've also been, due to some of my work, been reading a lot of case studies around healthcare chains in developing countries. And when companies get involved, large businesses get involved in healthcare from the point of view of employee needs, there's typically two things that happen. One, they focus on cost optimization. So they get the health industry to be more efficient in terms of the cost and how they incur money. But they also tend to improve quality because they demand more. Because they have buyer bargaining power. they tend to then be able to influence quality. I expect those two things to happen. So we'll have a bigger focus on quality, accompanied with, of course, the investment I mentioned on the other side, people investing in hospitals as a business, the corporates getting involved in trying to manage their costs and ensure their employees have better health care. All of these promise over a long time. We have a long way to go in healthcare in Nigeria, but promise finally, I have this vision, and I've had friends who have articulated this vision. I see no reason why healthcare cannot be transformed by Nigerian institutions the way financial services, for instance, was transformed by Nigerian institutions. And I suspect that we're at the beginnings of that cycle, of that transformation.
I think so too. Now, there's a very interesting question. One of the participants wants you to speak about why does it appear that COVID has a higher impact on Western economies than developing or developed economies than developing economies?
Well, I'm afraid of that question because I hope it doesn't draw me into the hydroxychloroquine controversy or worse still, the Trump controversy. But my wife is a pharmacist, and I've had the opportunity of discussing a lot. Apart from my own focus on the economic aspects of COVID-19, which is my natural terrain, I've had a lot of it with her as well. And my conviction is that hydroxychloroquine works in the context of early use, and therefore, and it's more freely used here in Africa, particularly in Nigeria. So everybody who gets on a COVID positive test uses hydroxychloroquine or some form of chloroquine. I suspect that if the evidence appears to be, well, not the medical evidence, because the medical, there's still controversy over that, but the anecdotal evidence and the evidence from professionals that I have access to suggests that people almost overwhelmingly use hydroxychloroquine and all of that, the zinc and the other thing, once there is a suspicion of COVID-19. And I do think that the evidence I've seen suggests that it works. Now, in the US in particular, the politics has become so dysfunctional, and I alluded to this. Once Trump says this works, half of the country is inclined to say, no, it doesn't work. And then the FDA and then all of the politics gets involved. And so there's almost a dysfunction in US policy making, deriving from the dysfunction in US politics that has meant that they've almost been unable to respond. I do also suspect that the scales of the shutdowns in the West have also been a bit too drastic. I admit that from the beginning, as the economist, my own primary concern is, are we going to destroy the economy? Are we going to shut down all economies because of a virus? Yes, we must fight the virus, we must be careful, but are we measuring the economic cost? So I do suspect that there's a level of dysfunction emanating from politics that has made the US and Western countries less able to respond. Finally, there's maybe a mitigating factor in favor of us. Our doctors are used to chloroquine. They're used to malaria. They're used to fevers. These things are more remote to Western doctors. So maybe in their defense, the presentations of COVID-19 are stranger than they would present to a Nigerian doctor who treats malaria every day. And therefore, maybe they have been more scientific, more evidence-based, but our people have tended to to get into action very quickly. Immediately they suspect COVID-19. And I suspect that partly explains why. Maybe also the fact that we have more young population in Africa. They have a lot more advanced distribution of population in the West. And therefore, also our young youth, I mean, the evidence suggests that youth are less susceptible. So it has been less of a disaster here than in the West.
And then there's a question here. What's the strategy for a circular economy?
A secular?
Yes.
As in S-E-C-U-L-A-R or circle? C-I-R?
Oh, no. So sorry. Circular as in C-I-R.
Secular.
Yeah. So maybe we'll come back to that. One other question is about reorientation of the workforce and assessing their readiness for the unfolding new normal.
In fact, that goes without saying. I think the biggest companies can begin to do is first assess their readiness of the staff in terms of the technology competencies, the digital competence, the resources available to them, their familiarity with all of these things, but not even beyond the digital, their mindsets, their familiarity with scenario thinking. I deliberately didn't say scenario planning in the context of the individual, but the average professional should be trained to think what could happen. How does this affect us? What are the variables? What is going on outside? How, all of that knowledge economy thinking, investment, that then makes the firm ready to the next challenge. May not be a health pandemic, but it could also cause severe disruption. At the end of the day, the resilience and the adaptability for organizations rests on the investments they've made in their people and the culture they built around responding to issues, swift response, building capabilities, and ensuring that they have people who can think strategically and think in terms of scenarios. So absolutely, organizations, I want to expect, in fact, I'll be surprised that we still have to say this. Organizations will have to invest greatly in getting their people ready for a digital environment, for a knowledge environment, for a global environment, and for a world of disruption across industries and sectors.
Now, what would you, the two issues that have been raised by participants, one, cybersecurity, we're all now sort of 20 out of 24 hours in a cyber world functioning, not even going from physical to digital. We're forever now on digital. So what does that mean for cybersecurity? If you could say a few words. Also, being in a country where trust is a major issue. So from a business perspective, how do you weigh lack of trust, which requires a more physical verification than going fully digital?
Excellent questions, both of them. I mean, cybersecurity, look, the thing is, it's a big issue. Like we said, you have to do payments online. The banks are not even able to take people in their banking halls anyway. So cybersecurity has become a big issue. Now, every scenario has a risk. And so the risks are arising from the new environment are these things. But guess what? Nigerian firms have a lot of, some high technology people have told me before that Nigeria has the most efficient security features around payments in the world. Why? Because they have to assume that a large percentage of every attempt to extract a payment out of their system is fraudulent. Maybe in the US, they didn't have to make that assumption. But yeah, you have to assume that half of, or even all of the transactions that somebody attempts to process through you are fraudulent. And therefore, you're built redundant. So now you use tokens, you use several levels of verification. They send something direct to your phone, then you do a token, you do this. Almost 3 or 4 levels of protection built in. So those are the risks that we will now have to counterbalance in the era of this. And I take the point the gentleman or lady mentioned about trust highly seriously, because hey, this is the same country in which we have 2 significant exports, Invictus, who defrauded the US financial system of millions of dollars, and the Hush Puppy, who operated out of Dubai and did more or less the same thing. So the trust issue is a real issue. I guess the issues around knowing your customer outside of the virtual world. Remember, transactions are different from relationships. So the relationship must be pretty verified, if I may put it that way. Relationship must be pretty verified, but there's a different thing about transactions. And once you know who you're dealing with, you now build protection around transactions across the levels of redundancy that you find efficient and possible. But I do not in any way minimize these factors. I say that they are the new normal, they're the new realities around life. One of the things we can do from a policy point of view to help. So one day I noticed recently that, of course, I have a BVN, like everybody else who use banking services. And I noticed that I saw an NIN, a national identity number verification, added to my BVN, which I thought was good. So one of the things we can do from the policy point of view to help is to integrate databases. So we should be able to tie my BVN to my PVC, which is my permanent voting card, to my national identity card number, to my driver's license, and any other form of my phone number, such that there are multiple levels of data integration that helps to prevent someone. So if somebody just comes with a 1-string number, the bank is on notice that no. So what's your BVN? What's your national identity number? What's your PVC? And then those different databases, if we do the job at the national level of integrating those databases, I think it will help significantly minimize those possibilities of fraudulent conduct across the virtual environment.
So we would also like you to say a few words on the informal sector. I mean, given the critical importance of that sector to Nigeria.
Okay, I mean, I think there may be there are a few people on this call who sat in my classes in strategy, either as executive MBA students, relatively mature people, or even full-time MBA students. And I used to joke, I joke that strategy is not an esoteric thing that applies only to large corporations. And I remember one of my favorite jokes is the woman who comes when there is agbado and roasts agbado. And immediately the agbado supply begins to dry up, you see her selling mangoes. And then as mangoes goes, you see her doing boli.
Yeah.
And then, she's practicing strategy. She's looking at the state of supplies. She's looking at the market demand. She's looking at the availability of inputs. She's looking at her supply chain. She's never been trained in strategy. And that's why I say I like patterns as a way of understanding strategy. Because she's looking for patterns. She was not taught anything about this concept, but she's observing patterns and she's responding to those patterns and creating her own patterns out of it. And there emerges a strategy. So first of all of our conversation, understandably, there may not be many informal participants on this call, but all of this conversation applies to them. One of the problems of Nigeria, unfortunately, is that crises like this wipe out the bottom. So they wipe out many of these people at the bottom. When we had the lockdown, that woman could not do boli, she could not do agbado, she could not do anything. And she was, policy impliedly expected her to just stay at home and die. But she wouldn't do that. So she would put the agbado or the whatever in front of her house rather in the market and would survive somehow. So one of the things I would say at the policy level, I like the fact that particularly this current vice president is passionate about social investment and social sustainability and the weaker people. I think we should continue to refine those mechanisms for helping the poor, for improving the informal sector, for drawing the informal sector into the formal economy, for providing lower cost services for informal sector participants so that their transaction costs are lower, and for policy to remember that 50% of our GDP, actually the trade and all of those things comes from micro, small and medium enterprises. So we should focus policy more on them and ensure that when we talk about all of these things, COVID-19 pandemic, and we're thinking about how to help large corporates and all of that, admittedly, the Economic Sustainability Plan claims to want to do that. I hope it finds effective ways of doing that.
Hello?
Yeah, hello.
Okay, you can hear me. Good.
Yeah.
For a split second, we were both frozen. Now,
Okay.
I have another question. Oh, and I just want to say thank you very much, Maima, for that question on the informal sector. Really important. So, you know, sometimes when you're all in the same country, same industry, same size, you use the same consultants, we're all using RTC advisory, the strategies start to look the same. So how do you win? How do you distinguish yourself?
You know, I have, thank you, Cecilia. I have interesting perspectives on that. You know, I first of all, acknowledge the reality of what you've said. And that's the reality I've observed. The reality in the particular case of financial services that is made worse by regulation. So the regulator, for good or for bad reasons, has compelled Nigerian banks. I'm a student of the strategic evolution of the Nigerian financial services. I love studying that sector and how it has evolved. And especially because I was there. But I was always a strategist, even when I didn't fully understand the principles. So even in those small days when I was trying to run around GT Bank, I was always wondering why we're so different from, say, UBA or any other bank for that matter. And we used to have great strategic diversity across Nigerian financial services. Sedo chose what he wanted to do and did it very well. And while Tayo Adeoku and Fola Adeola chose what they wanted to do and did it very well. And there were people in FSDH, for instance, who chose what they wanted to do and did it very well, etc. Well, guess what? Policy compelled everybody to become the same. Universal banking, minimum capital, regulated capital, risk-based supervision. All of these policies, for good intentions, the road to hell is always paved with good intentions. But so we eliminated strategic diversity across our industry. And then our companies also caught the fashion of using the same consultants. So everybody went same people. And so one of the implications of that is that if you are all doing the same things, execution becomes the strategic difference. Plus, what then facilitates execution is your culture and the people you have. So it now boils down to the same people winning all the time. Because if you're all trying to do the same thing, the people who have the best people, who have the best leadership, and who have the management systems for ensuring efficiency will always win. And so the gap between the good and the bad continues to widen. That's one. Now, but I do believe as a student of strategy, that in the application of strategy is always contextual. If we did strategy correctly, we will not all be doing the same things. So the fact that this strategic, I've admitted the role of the regulator in compelling uniformity, but beyond that, there's also a room for poor strategy, because people don't think deeply enough about how they're different. And their consultants don't think deeply enough about how they are different. So I always feel that strategy is like an individual. If you came to Okweme Agbaje and told me to live my life in a certain manner, and you came to BC Adeyemi and told her exactly the same thing, you're probably not doing the right strategy. Because we have different competencies, we have different personalities, we have different makeup, we have different abilities, we have different motivations. And if you really thought deeply enough about the personality of the firm and where they're coming from and their trajectory and their evolution, there should be variations in their strategic trajectories. But that's not what we do, admittedly. We all try to do the same thing, and we all look alike, and therefore, in the context of what we are trying to do, everybody doing the same thing, and everybody trying to become the same thing, what you find is that it is the person who executes best, who has the best collections, who has the best people that would always win.
I'm going to ask, I'm a woman, so I have to ask this question. Where's the place of a gender strategy? I just had to do it. I wouldn't be Cecilia if I didn't do that.
Cecilia, let me admit one thing. What we know in strategy is that constructive diversity tends to be an advantage in a firm. Now, I'm careful in saying constructive diversity. Diversity for the sake of it may be dysfunctional, and diversity that is not based on, I'm going to be politically incorrect. We do a lot of diversity that is not constructive in Nigeria. That's why I'm making that clarification. So we do things that just boils down to allocation. And that's not constructive diversity. But when we when a board puts Cecilia on the board, that's constructive diversity. They have a woman who offers the female perspective, but who also has high quality, global, continental experience, specific competencies, and technical competencies to bring to the table. So there's a different perspective from what you would typically get on the board of First Bank for Cecilia being there. Now that's constructive diversity. If we do more of constructive diversity in our firms, in our boardrooms, in the management of businesses, along the dimensions of gender, I love that. And I think there are enough good women to go around. But also across other dimensions. If it is constructive, religion, culture, all of those, I'm professional, the type of skill types that they bring to the board and to the management. So you benefit from engineers being in the banking industry. I saw that happen to us in GT Bank when I worked there. We had all types of professionals, pharmacists, doctors, engineers, everybody. I came into banking from the background of law. And it was a beautiful thing. It was one, and we had men and women, and we had Antimo. I mean, we had all of them. We had great people across sex, across gender, across professional competencies, background, age, everything. And I think the outcome was fantastic. So if we do constructive diversity, including gender, yeah, the impact on corporate strategy will be excellent. But if we do dysfunctional diversity, it will be dysfunctional. You're muted.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. So 2 last questions, and we will round up. First is your last words, and then in your last words, you know, there's always this perception that in Nigeria, also on the continent of Africa, we really don't appreciate the importance of strategy. And that is one of the critical reasons that we're having our development challenges, that lack of appreciation of strategy. So if you could just respond to that and then give us your last words for this fireside chat under the Iroko tree, so that Anne could come and give the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia. It's been fantastic.
For me too.
I don't think I've enjoyed myself this much in a long time. I find talking this very elevated types of conversations around strategy, scenario planning, business environment, policy. I find it highly useful and beneficial. And I thank you for facilitating such a beautiful conversation. And I thank BC and her beautiful team, Nike and the guys at DCSL. I've really enjoyed myself. So to your question, I know that it goes beyond. Look, in Nigeria, I don't think it is just that we don't value strategy. I think we don't value intellect and intellectual input. We disdain knowledge and learning. Increasingly, we got to that, but we didn't start that way. We built the regions in the pre-colonial and post-colonial days on the basis of strong knowledge. We took our experts from all over the world, brought them into our civil services and into our universities. Both of us went to Ife, great institution, world-class, and we built the beginnings of our nation on strong intellect, strong planning, strong thinking. I mean, we have the beautiful heritage of the Western region of Nigeria, in which we had competencies. We built television before Spain and Portugal and many of the countries of Europe in Ibadan. So that was not how we started. But my experience is that with military rule has contributed, and the type of way we build the public space, especially around politics, has contributed. So we actually disdain knowledge and intellect. That's the foundational ailment that we have to remedy. But beyond that, yes, we don't value intellect. I mean, you know, one of the attributes of a primary society is you value what you see. Primary goods and services, we deal in food, agriculture, you know, Maslow. So I have found, and the public sector equivalent is valuing policy, good policy, intelligent policy, reasonable policy. I always tell people, if you spend 200 years doing the wrong policy, the outcomes will be wrong. Even if you took 200 years, if we decided to wait around the way we're trying to build our electricity sector, we would have the same outcome for 200 years. Unfortunately, I know that, but hey, until we get the policy environment right, and then it could take 5 years, it could take 10 years, but at least we would have got the work done. So in the public space, we don't spend enough time on intelligent policy. We're emotional about policy often, and we spend time doing the wrong thing and hope to get a better outcome. It's the same thing in the corporate sector. We don't spend enough time thinking uniquely around ourselves, how our firm's different, what should we be doing differently. We don't invest sufficiently in the intellectual resources around the firm. And to compound it, we often have bad governance, which you pointed our attention to. So I hope that things will change. I think things can change. And if we have people like many of those on this call, and Cecilia and many of the others in DCSL, and many of the people I've seen on the call, take more effort to improve the quality of the conversations in the corporate sector, then we can get things right. So I want to thank everybody who has participated. It's a privilege and it's an honor for me to have been able to have this time with you all. Thank you so much.
And it's just been great for me. I have learned so much. I'm so proud of you, Opeyemi. God bless you. Thank you very much, DCSL. And thank you very much, the participants. You've stayed with us from the beginning to our wrap up. God bless you. And Anne, we'll love to hear from you as you help us close this chat.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Good evening, everyone. And thank you so much to Mr. Opeyemi Agbaje. Every time you talk on the subject of strategy, your passion for that topic comes to the fore, and today was no exception. We're deeply grateful for your time. It was our privilege. The privilege was all ours to have you. We're very honored by your presence. And to our able, distinguished moderator, we thank you very much, ma'am, for your time and for coordinating the entire session. The questions that you raised during the fireside chat and the questions that the participants threw on the table elicited a deeper and wider and diverse insight on the topic of corporate strategy. For me, I think the highlight was the very practical reference that Mr. Agbaje made to the issue of the Agbado seller. I read a comment from one of the participants saying that for him, that was indeed a very critical takeaway, and he learned something from that. So thank you very much, sir, and thank you, ma'am. Before we round off, I'd like to just quickly mention that we have a training coming up sometime towards the end of the month, on the 28th of August precisely, on the topic business continuity and crisis management. In addition to that topic, which will be the focus of the training, we'll also be discussing issues around IT governance, an audit perspective of the Nigerian Code of Corporate Governance, and then auditing organizational culture and ethics. We do hope that you find the time to join us for that training. You'll find additional information on the training on all our social media platforms and on our website. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all for your time this evening, for making the time to join us. We do know that everyone is busy around this time, and it's Friday, people are rounding up for the weekend, but you took the time to join us, so we thank you deeply. We look forward to welcoming you at our future events and wish you a very pleasant weekend and a fruitful week ahead. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening. And to Mr. Agbaje, thank you. God bless you. Mrs. Cecilia, God bless you very much. Thank you. Our dear participants, thank you very much. Have a wonderful evening and bye-bye. From all of us at DCSL, bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Is managing your board meetings exhausting? Do you spend a lot of time and money sending out board packs while directors spend time and money to travel in from different locations? Well, meet Betty. She has the solution. This was also Betty. The difference? She manages the board more efficiently now. She uses eHorizon eBoard, a state-of-the-art, secure online portal that gives board members instant access to information such as past meeting board packs, strategic plans, policy manuals, orientation material, audit reports, and much more. With eBoard, directors can now also make and share annotations on documents, ensure regulatory compliance while minimizing risk using the compliance dashboard. eBoard simplifies evaluation and report tabulation. It's transparent, saves time, and reduces cost. And when it comes to approvals, directors have centralized access to relevant resources needed to make well-informed decisions. Betty can capture minutes, matters arising, and share board packs. And with inbuilt video conferencing, board members can now virtually join the meeting from anywhere in the world. eBoard. Governance with a tech touch.